At the G20 summit, the Egyptian Prime Minister highlights his country's hope to fulfill the aspirations of African people. Hamas accuses the Israeli military of blatantly violating the Gaza ceasefire. And Donald Trump says Ukraine's president will eventually need to accept the US-backed peace plan. Hello there, good afternoon and welcome to Q News. It's 4 o'clock here in Cairo. Let's start with the G20, shall we? South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has said that there was overwhelming consensus to adopt the summit declaration despite the US boycott. Hosting this weekend's G20 summit in Johannesburg, Ramaphosa praised delegations for working in good faith with South Africa to finalize a meaningful outcome document and stressed that nothing should diminish the significance of the first African G20 presidency. Key agenda items focus on climate-related disasters, green energy financing, critical minerals, and fair borrowing systems for poorer nations. Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli has represented Egypt's President El-Sisi at the opening session of the 2025 two-day G20 summit in Johannesburg. The session, inaugurated by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, marked Egypt's participation as a guest country. This year's summit, held under the theme Solidarity, Equality and Sustainability, focuses on food security, debt challenges, climate transition and strengthening partnerships between developing and advanced economies. Madbouli attended alongside Egypt's Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Ati, the Egyptian President's G20 and BRICS Sherpa Sharif Kamel, and Egypt's Ambassador to South Africa Ahmed Ali Sharif. Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli has emphasized the urgent need to implement the Trump plan for Gaza and stressed that a just resolution to the Palestinian cause must be based on the two-state solution. In his address to the G20 summit, Madbouli announced that Egypt will host a conference focused on early recovery and reconstruction in Gaza. He also highlighted Egypt's hope to fulfill the aspirations of African people and noted that the Sharm el-Sheikh Peace Summit has paved the way towards a more stable Middle East.
We also commend South Africa's leadership in steering the group's work and in advancing Africa's priorities. In a world faced by unprecedented global challenges, the G20 has a critical role in addressing the main global economic challenges, including the reform of the international financial architecture to ensure that it is responsive to the developmental needs of developing countries. This includes enhancing access to concessional finance through establishing new financial mechanisms while strengthening the effectiveness of existing ones, improving the business models and financing capabilities of the IFIs and the MDBs, and ensuring stronger representation of developing countries in the global economic governance.
Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli there. Now, at the G20 summit in Johannesburg, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has presented a 5-point plan to promote global economic growth, emphasizing debt reduction and lowering tariffs. He thanked South African President Cyril Ramaphosa for hosting the summit and wished the United States success for the 2026 presidency. Leaders adopted a declaration addressing climate change, renewable energy targets, and the heavy debt burdens on poorer nations. The draft was prepared without US involvement and highlighted issues previously opposed by the Trump administration, signaling a focus on sustainable growth and international cooperation. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz held a trilateral meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Johannesburg. The discussions followed their reported talks with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Leaders emphasized that any resolution for Ukraine must fully involve Kyiv, preserve its sovereignty and ensure its future security. Decisions related to the EU and NATO require approval from all member states. The meeting aimed to coordinate a European and Western response to President Trump's peace plan proposal demanding Ukraine's acceptance by November 27th. Also, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has met European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Johannesburg ahead of the G20 summit. Starmer emphasized that all decisions regarding Ukraine must ultimately be made by Ukraine itself, underscoring his commitment to Kyiv's sovereignty. Similarly, von der Leyen expressed support for Ukraine via X, affirming that no decisions should be taken about the country without its involvement. G7 nations and European leaders, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the European Council President Antonio Costa, have convened on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Johannesburg to discuss the United States' proposed peace plan for Ukraine. The E3 security group, that's France, Britain and Germany, met ahead of the broader discussion, joined by Finland, Norway, Spain and the Netherlands. That comes while the US and Russia negotiate a 28-point roadmap to end the conflict. Brussels has been excluded. Von der Leyen pledged outreach to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who expressed readiness for constructive and prompt cooperation with Washington. Kyiv held consultations in Switzerland on the plan. Now let's head over to our newsroom where Hala El-Hamalawi is there for us. Hala.
Thank you so much, Mark. For further analysis, we're joined from Cairo by international relations expert, Mr. Mohammed El-Yemeni. Welcome to Q News, sir. Let me start by asking you, how significant is Egypt's role as a guest country at the 2025 G20 summit in Johannesburg for its regional and, of course, global diplomatic standing?
My greetings to you and to your viewers, and thank you for hosting me. Egypt's role on three themes: politically, diplomatically, and economically, whether in the Middle East or the African Horn. The G20 summit with the major countries that have trust in Egypt and Egyptian leadership. This is not in this time only, even in the last summits as well. Let's talk about three numbers, very important, and go back to Egypt and the effectiveness of the diplomatic role and economic and mutual trust, the connection between European countries and Egypt, and therefore the African countries' wealth and resources. 85% of the GMP is in the summit. The other number is 75% of international trade and 60% of the world population. Going back to Egypt, Egypt in the last few years hosted this summit. And the other thing, with the leadership of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, or even the Prime Minister, discussed the importance of pouring investments in African countries, the developing countries, the poor economics. We have to stand with them. There is also facilitating solutions regarding to the debts of these countries on the economic level. We don't forget as well that Egypt presents 12% of Suez Canal for these European countries and other countries as well, and the Red Sea, and the effectiveness of Egypt in the trade, the effectiveness of Egypt's role in the trade, in the world trade, also diplomatic role. We do not forget the Sharm el-Sheikh Peace Summit and Cairo Summit that were held in Cairo since the aggression on Gaza on this October 7th, 2023. Since then and afterwards, we have seen effective diplomatic role, whether on the level of organizations and humanitarian organizations, and Egypt has
Yes,
its
I want to take it
heaviness.
from here, sir. How can Egypt leverage its participation in the G20 to advance African and also Middle Eastern priorities on food security and climate transition?
This is a very important question, and linked to what I said earlier, and these countries trust in Egypt, and how much it's effective that Egypt will use the investments of these in these countries, and also food security is very important to Egypt, because we tackled in the last period, especially after COVID-19, what Egypt also what the African Horn experienced, and the whole world, not only the Africa, and also European countries and major countries. And also the other thing in regards to investments, attracting investments in Egypt, inviting Egypt as a guest country. As I said earlier, it has its significance, but if we delved into African countries do not have infrastructure, do not have lack education, sustainable development, and they need everything currently. And the needs of African countries is one of them is food security, because it considers one of the main priorities of this summit. And previously this summit was used to discuss economic matters in the upcoming year and the following one, but some changes made, like politics, AI, and others. This is a very
If we
important
elaborate
point.
on Egypt's regional role, in what ways does Egypt's emphasis on the two-state solution at the G20 align with broader international approaches to resolving the Palestinian issue?
Yes, this is a very important question. Thank you for this question. And in the last period, there was a host acknowledgement from Britain, from the UK, and others acknowledging recognizing Palestine, and holding up the two-state solution. And Egypt uses this important event, especially with the lack of media coverage in this regard. But Egypt, with the leadership of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, since the aggression on Gaza, spoke about the two-state solution, and also they tackled this when he sat with Donald Trump. And we also know that the real obstacle lies in Israel, and the U.S. Support to Israel, although that U.S. To some extent showing its good intention in regards to peace and two-state solutions. But this is all theoretically. The other thing in regards to two-state solution countries, we are talking about non-Arab countries are supporting Palestinian cause, because after the aggression we have seen protests to pressure Western governments to acknowledge and recognize not sending weapons to Israel.
Well, given the G20 focus on solidarity, equality, and sustainability, how can Egypt position itself as a bridge between African nations and global decision-making forums?
For sure, I give several examples and proofs to viewers. When the U.S. wanted to cease fire and holding an agreement, whether prolonged or temporary, it contacted Egypt because Egypt, since the war sparked, exceeded mediator. It became the connection between Hamas and Israel as well. Also, in regards to Africa, we know that in the previous last years, even before the aggression, we've seen intensified visits to some African countries, and partnerships were made and agreements were made, meaning that these African countries that suffer a lot, Egypt represents a trusted partner, very important partner, to send some things to these to European countries, because we know that European countries have partnerships in the African countries with by the passage of time and implementing what Egypt refers to in regard whether the infrastructure, sustainable development, and education, illegal migration, and addressing poverty and other things important to African countries, which gives Egypt importance and significance to those countries and significance to European countries as well.
Yes.
If we want investments in African countries, we have to contact Egypt and go back to Egypt and to be the connection hub between us and Africa, between European countries and African countries.
Okay. So how might the adoption of the Johannesburg G20 declaration without U.S. involvement signal shifts in global economic and climate policy priorities?
The absence of the U.S., we know in the last period, Russia and China, and I will go back to this summit. I would like to clarify to viewers, partnerships were made and agreements between Russia and Arab countries. This bothered the U.S. China has billions of dollars agreements in the Middle and Arab region, also in African Horn, and most African countries have relationships with China. The absence of the U.S. With the absence of the U.S., there are many partnerships and agreements are made, whether in African countries or between among the countries in the summit. We have tackled about 85% of the world economy, 75% of international trade, and also 60% of the world population. Even the former President Joe Biden were bothered and talked about G20 summit and the absence of the U.S. I think, in my humble opinion, this summit will result in investments, especially after COVID-19 and Russia-Ukraine war and climate change. Many issues were tackled, and to some extent they addressed some of them. This is added to the G20 summit and the importance of this summit every year.
Yes. Well, from Cairo, that was Mr. Mohammed Al-Yamani, International Relations Expert. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us here on Q News. Now we go back again to Mark in our studio. To you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Helen. Her guests were just explaining to us there. Egypt is very much at the G20 involved in international affairs, and Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Ati has met British National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell on the sidelines of the G20 summit. They discussed developments in the Palestinian cause, with Abdel Ati stressing full implementation of the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, early recovery and reconstruction steps, and unhindered humanitarian access to Gaza. He urged coordinated international action to enforce the UN Security Council resolution and expedite the formation of the International Stabilization Force. He also highlighted Egypt's preparations for hosting the Early Recovery and Reconstruction Conference and hoped for UK participation. The meeting also covered Sudan, where Abdel Ati reviewed Egypt's efforts within the quartet to support de-escalation, a full ceasefire and a political process safeguarding Sudan's unity and stability. Also, Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Ati has praised Spain's recognition of the Palestinian state and urged full implementation of the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, ceasefire consolidation and active Spanish participation in Egypt's Gaza Recovery Conference. That came during his meeting with Spain's Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares on the sidelines of the G20 summit, where they discussed strengthening bilateral ties and regional developments. Abdel Ati praised the upgrade of relations to a strategic partnership during the visit of Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to Madrid in February this year, and welcomed upcoming visits by Spain's king, stressing the need to implement their outcomes. He highlighted expanding cooperation in investment, tourism, culture, education, healthcare and migration. Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Ati has met his Nigerian counterpart Yusuf Dugar on the sidelines of the G20 to discuss strengthening bilateral ties and key African issues. Abdel Ati highlighted the progress achieved after his July 2025 visit to Abuja and stressed advancing political consultations and security cooperation, including Egypt's readiness to share counter-terrorism expertise and training. The two counterparts also explored boosting investments in agriculture, energy, construction, IT and oil and gas. They reviewed regional developments, including Gaza reconstruction efforts and the need to enforce the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, and agreed to coordinate closely on Sudan's crisis. Now let's have the latest developments from Gaza.
And then, of course, we have the host tonight, and I just want to thank you very much. It was a reason we chose Egypt, because you were very helpful, and very, very helpful. Everybody wanted to have this, but we really thought it was appropriate, and you are a great leader. And he's a fantastic man and a fantastic general, by the way. But he's a great president, and I want to thank Egypt and all of your representatives for treating us all so well. Thank you very much.
Hamas has accused the Israeli military of blatantly violating the Gaza ceasefire by removing the yellow demarcation line and advancing westward, calling the move a clear breach of the agreement. The movement reiterated its rejection of any attempts by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government to impose new conditions contradicting what was agreed upon. Hamas urged the international community to compel Israel to honor its commitments and stop actions that undermine the ceasefire process. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry has condemned the recent settler attacks in Nablus, Ramallah, Bethlehem and Al Khalil, calling them a dangerous escalation. It said the arson, vandalism and destruction of homes and property reflect a systematic policy aimed at terrorizing Palestinians and enforcing forced displacement in the occupied territories. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry held Israel fully responsible for these crimes, accusing it of encouraging settler violence. It urged the UN Security Council to act immediately by forming an international peacekeeping force to protect Palestinians across all occupied areas. Now moving on to Lebanon, where the Lebanese army commander has emphasized the urgent need to halt all attacks and end Israel's occupation of Lebanese territory. He stated that the Lebanese army's operations in the South Litani region are proceeding according to their scheduled timeline. He reaffirmed Lebanon's commitment to the ceasefire agreement and to United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, stressing continued cooperation with UNIFIL to maintain peace and stability in southern Lebanon. And in Sudan, Sudan's Sovereign Council Chairman Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has affirmed that the armed forces are supporting units and will continue fighting the rebellious militias, as per his description, without retreat until they are completely eradicated. During his visit to Katina in White Nile State, al-Burhan emphasized the military's determination to, and I quote, purify every inch of national territory. A statement from the armed forces spokesperson noted al-Burhan's acknowledgement of casualties sustained during ongoing operations. He also praised Katina residents for supporting the army, highlighting the area's symbolic role in training fighters and backing military efforts. Meanwhile, the Sudanese army has intensified strikes on rapid support forces and positions west of the capital of North Kordofan, El Obeid. It also targeted RSF sites in Bab Nusa in West Kordofan. These attacks are part of ongoing military operations aimed at regaining control of the Darfur region. And to the United States, where US President Donald Trump has said Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy will eventually need to accept the US-backed peace plan aimed at ending the conflict with Russia. Trump noted that despite his strong relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, resolving the war requires two to tango, which means that both parties involved in a situation or argument are equally responsible for it. He stressed the urgency created by winter, rising casualties and repeated strikes on Ukraine's energy grid. The draft plan would require Kyiv to cede territory, limit its military and abandon NATO ambitions. Trump said he had warned Zelenskyy earlier that he lacked the leverage to secure settlement entirely on his own terms.
They're averaging 6,000 or 7,000 a week between the two of them, dead.
And just before we go now, time to recap the main headlines this afternoon. At the G20 summit, the Egyptian Prime Minister highlights his country's hope to fulfill the aspirations of African people. Hamas accuses the Israeli military of blatantly violating the Gaza ceasefire. And as we've just been hearing, Donald Trump says Ukraine's president will eventually need to accept the US-backed peace plan. Now, for more stories and live updates, you can follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at Q News EGY. For all of us here, thanks for watching for now, but stay tuned because In Depth is on the way next.